Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. I've had a day out on the battlefield in Normandy with Colin, and any day on the battlefield is a fantastic day, so I'm in a good mood. We're continuing, as you saw there in the video, our Monte, Cassino and Beyond series, and we're talking about General Mark Clark. So he was the commander, of course, of the US Fifth Army. He's a somewhat divisive figure, less so than some of the other people like MacArthur and Montgomery, but definitely there are different opinions. So is he innovative or inferior, hero or zero? Well, to share his thoughts is Jon Mikolashek, professor of US history and author of the very best biography on the general, and links to purchase Jon's book are, of course, in the description below. So I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Jon. How are you today?
I'm good. How y'all doing?
We're good. So Mark Clark, he's not as divisive as some of the generals, but he definitely is some people have opinions about. So, you know, you've written about Patton in the First World War. You've written about Clark. What drew you to Clark in the first place, and also what's your own particular background?
Yeah, I mean that's pretty easy. I have a good story on kind of how I became a Clark historian. But yeah, I got my PhD from the Florida State University, which if those following the academia, there's not as many military history jobs going around. So Florida State was one of the few military history programs. And so I joined that. I come from an Army family. So the Army has always kind of been around and in my life. And it was during my undergrad years where I met Martin Blumenson, who I assume some folks can still remember. And I sent you a letter, one of the last letters he wrote to me before this thing. But it was kind of a weird story. My uncle is a retired general officer, and you see that note. My uncle commanded the 3rd U.S. Army, so there's a linkage to Patton there. And when I was an undergrad writing on Patton and the slapping incidents, I ran into a historian, older gentleman that knew Blumenson. He lived. I grew up in D.C. area, so he lived in Northwest D.C. So I just knocked on his apartment door one day, and, you know, I'm like 22 years old. Hey, can you come talk to me? And we developed a nice relationship for the last roughly 3 years of his life. And I would visit him about once a month, and we would drink gimlets together. He was a big gimlet drinker. Gin gimlets is what he liked. And he really impressed upon me a lot of kind of views I still maintain on the war, not just Patton, but Clark, who he was very sympathetic to. And I remember drinking gimlets with him one time, and he got real emotional about Clark, how he went down to the Citadel because he wrote a short book toward the end of Clark's life on General Clark, and he was sympathetic to him. Blumenson actually thought Clark was Jewish, and Martin Blumenson was Jewish, thought that Clark had converted at that point. And Clark denied it, according to Blumenson, but Blumenson believed it. I never found any evidence, but, you know, you never know. And it was there that as I went through my master's program and then went on to PhD, we were talking about, you know, what to write on. And he said, you need to write on Clark. And so I was like, good enough for me. And that's kind of how I got into it. And then from then on, my major professor, who passed away a few years ago, Jim Jones, was more than happy to do something on Clark in Italy. And it wasn't Band of Brothers or Normandy, so it was a little easier.
Yeah. And yeah, I think I'm glad what you said about Blumenson, because I think he's still highly regarded by historians, but I think maybe the general public have slightly lost a little bit of understanding of his role in things. I mean, I'm currently writing my book on La Haye Dupuy and Breakout and Pursuit, which is whatever it is, 50 years old or something now, is essential to my understanding of that. And I'm amazed that there hasn't really been anything written about what I'm tackling since his seminal work on then. Kevin Hemel, you know, he talks about him with his Patton books, how, you know, Martin was leading the way in the study of that. So he was he kind of caught that area in between kind of being innovative, but also kind of old school Martin Blumenson. His works are kind of they bridged a gap, I think, of generations. But we're not here to talk about Blumenson. But what an amazing chance you had to meet him there. But so Blumenson was a Clark fan. So I assume, therefore, you began your work on this, kind of feeding off that idea.
Yes. Now, my uncle, who I was also the historian in my family, would kind of balance me out. And but it goes back to how I view history, and this goes back also to Blumenson, but also just how I think a good historian should be. Was you got to be balanced. You got to see what the sources say, what the diaries say, what the documentation say, but also then, as I'm in professional military education, for those that don't, it's acronyms PME, and I teach at a war college where we teach war planning. And when I have understood, and as I've gotten older, I think it's even more true, is historians, and I think particularly true of Clark, are a little too quick to blame people for decisions. And when we're sitting in our office chair 50 years later in the air conditioning room, I think historians can be unfair, but don't consider what the commander or the decision maker was thinking or had at the time he made these decisions. And so I've always tried to be, I think, a fairly objective historian on this. I think now, again, I'm fully aware when I was writing this book that no matter what I wrote about Clark, someone on Amazon is going to say, I love Clark. And then someone's going to be like, he's a bastard. And how dare you, and I'm like, you can't win. So it's fine. I thought, and looking back on it, it's been 10 years since I wrote it. I think it's fairly objective on Clark as much as you can be. So I was not against Clark, but I wasn't trying to write a love letter to Clark either.
I mean, we're halfway through this Cassino series, and we've had some historians on. Mark Zelke is not a particular Clark fan. James Holland hasn't been on, but he's become a Clark fan in the 2 books he's written about Italy. So people's positions can change. And if I've learned one thing so far during this Cassino series, is that Monte Cassino, the Rome campaign, there's a lot of things changing. There's a lot of terrain changes. There's lots of rivers to cross. The Germans are putting up a staunch defense. There's a multinational army to be hold of. Units are transferring in and out of the Fifth Army, things like that. Commanders are reaching a point where they can't function anymore. New commanders coming in. Air power is a problem. Weather is a problem. Logistics is a problem because it's all going to Normandy. So for me, Clark going into the Italian campaign has a lot of. I think James Holland described it on a Salerno show. He's going into the whole campaign with one arm tied behind his back. Is that a fair analogy from your interpretation?
Yeah, and I think what James Holland's book, which is more recent, I think is. I was actually kind of happy to see a historian take a little bit more positive view on Clark.
Yeah.
Because I do think it's needed, and some of his conclusions kind of were the same with me. Now, I do think Clark and the Fifth Army had their hands tied behind their back. I think that's a fair analogy. Now, where Clark, I think, could view it as a British conspiracy at times. You only have so many resources. And as you all am seeing in the chat, like D-Day is just around the corner in Normandy. And getting the landing ship vehicles, equipment that they got for Anzio was the only reason, I would argue, the only way that happened was because Churchill wanted it.
Yeah.
So outside of, one of the top leaders in the entire war, they were very limited. This was a theater a theater of economy here.
Yep. No, that was a theme that came up. But just to kind of begin the conversation, John, we had an early comment before you'd even started talking, in fact, from Zane here. And I think this is representative of the people who don't like Clark. Clark let the German armies escape the Gustav Line for the glory of taking Rome, which is a particular way of putting a series of events. That's not unfactual, that statement there in some ways, but it's got a certain bias. So, the Rome is the elephant in the room, isn't it, John? That's the That's the decision. So take us through what your version of Clark going into Italy and what dilemmas he's facing, the pressure he's under, as I say, as you said there, from Church and others, and how he makes these decisions, and why you think he makes the decisions he does.
Yeah, and I was looking at, I don't want to make this a historiography class, but looking at Lloyd Clark's book, Carlo D'Este's book, which I still think is, D'Este is still one of the great writers. And then including, I actually had to reread most of mine. It's been a couple of years. Where I stand on this, I still stand by the book where I do think his decision to go into Rome was probably not a great idea. Now, I also don't think this idea, and I see it in the questions too, he let the Germans escape. And I don't think anything in war is that easy. And nothing that the Germans had done up to that point, particularly in Italy, gave me the idea that if Clark had continued on with Alexander's plan, that it would have been the 10th German army just folds up and that's the end of the war. I think that's a little armchair quarterback, going on there a little bit. But I do think is that, again, going back to, teaching our, joint officers planning for war, operational art, campaigning. I think from what I can tell, and I think James Holland kind of reflects it too, is there was an idea of the plan was to get the 10th Army. Rome was secondary. And I think from very early on, Clark did not like that plan. I think that is not really up to debate anymore. That's just the way it was. I think, again, historians like to play armchair psychologists. I try to avoid it. And we talk about Patton. We could, every historian writes about how Patton had some kind of daddy mommy issue, and that's why he is the way he is. I think Clark wanted Rome for the historical value. He understood it was important. It was also important for his theater, who was not getting a lot of attention. But I do think he had become so skewed against the British view of how the war was going. I think it led him to look for avenues away from the plan that Lucian Truscott thought was a good one. And again, I tend to hold Truscott in high regard. I think that guy was probably one of the best field commanders across.
I'm with you on that. I heard there's a biography being written about him coming up, which will be really good because, really unsung, fantastic commander.
Yeah. And he didn't like the switching of the axis, the switching of the attack. Usually I think that's accurate. I think a lot of what the German commander said after the war kind of reflects that. But where I think, like particularly the more recent book by James Holland is, I don't think it's as easy as people think. And I see in the comments, we should have got the Germans. Okay. Is it that easy? I mean, most of the folks, if you've been to Italy, that terrain, it's not that easy. And as we all admit, we all agree that this is an economy of force mission.
Yeah.
But then it's like, well, you could easily just take a whole German army. I don't think it's as clear cut as that. I still go by what I wrote in the book, that it was his probably worst decision of the war. And that put me at odds with Clark's son, who I did interview. By marriage, we ended up being related, which I did not know. And when I went to meet, I'm 26 years old. I went to go meet Clark's son. And I knew going in that I was kind of asking about Rome, how Rome was, what did you think, now that you're, 50 years after the event. And when I got to his office, and the first thing you see is a giant portrait of his father. And so I'm like, oh boy, this is going to be tough. Yeah. And the first thing he said was, I think my dad's decision to take Rome was the greatest decision of his life. And I'm like, awesome.
That's a good starting point for a conversation, isn't it? Yeah.
So, he was very elderly. So, I was kind of, I didn't quite write that in the book. Now, I defended his father a lot in Salerno and Anzio, which he liked. But when it comes to Rome, I don't think it's as binary as we make it out to be. That had Clark done what Alexander wanted, they would take the 10th Army. If he would have taken Rome, and then I think about it, if we take it up a level at the operational level of war, I don't know how the war changes had they gone after the 10th Army and even they surrender it. They still have to fight up north. Anvil's still going to happen. The troops that are going to get pulled out are still going to get pulled out. D-Day's days away. So
let's take it back to Anzio. Sorry, not to interrupt your flow there, John. Let's take it back to Anzio, because we're in the Cassino series now, but we did an Anzio series in January, February. And obviously Lucas is the fool guy there, and we all know the quote about unleashing, what have you. So that's not Clark's fault, is it? But we had before we get to the Anzio and Lucas and Clark, we had a question earlier which I think we'd like to address. Is from Mad Cat, was General Clark the first choice for command in Italy? Was anybody else considered for Fifth Army for this?
Yeah, so in some of the stuff I've written about Patton, I would still stand by it. The best thing to happen to Patton's career was him slapping the soldiers in Italy. The reason why is, I think, had he not done that, I think, based on where Eisenhower, their relationship, I think Patton was going to Fifth Army first. And I do not see, and I am a unlike most academic historians who do not like Patton. I think as a military officer, Patton was tremendous. But the way he liked to fight did not lend itself towards good fighting in Italy. And so by him having to sit on the sidelines, it freed up Clark to take the Fifth Army and go to Italy. Where had Patton been in charge, I think it goes better. Sure. I don't know what that means strategically. It's still, the war is going to end this, not ending earlier. But I think for Patton, it was a blessing in hindsight. And then for Clark, I think he was excited about it at first because it's an army command. But then the war kind of transitions to France. And then that's where I think Clark had some resentment. And then Patton does a great job post D-Day, Cobra.
And there's lots of questions coming, which is fantastic. Yep. And another thing that I've concluded so far during this series is that, except for the 6th South African Armored Division, which we heard about yesterday, who seemed to go through the entire campaign with high morale. They went from the heel right the way up to Austria through the Alps. But there are big morale problems. Fifth Army, the 8th Army, across there, there's desertions, there's venereal disease, there's self-inflicted wounds, there's things like that. So let's go back to Rome again. And we can go back and forth in the timeline during this conversation, John, because there are certain points in the war where certain victories happened that were more for the public than they were for the strategic stroke tactical gain. I'm thinking the Dambusters raid for the British, the Doolittle raid, those kind of things where maybe the world just needs a bit of a boost, right? And regardless of the effect of Rome on the campaign for Italy, it was a boost for the people back home. It was probably a boost for the people in and around there. Maybe not the Canadians who didn't get a chance to go into the city there, which Norma brought up earlier on, but Rome would have been some kind of morale boost. Would you agree with that?
For a day at least, yeah.
Yeah.
And if we talk, as a proper American, the American public, by the time the fall of Rome hits, it's pretty much June 6th.
Yeah, exactly.
And I do think for the average soldier, junior officer on the ground, that meant something. And I do think a good commander, morale matters. Now, again, is a professional historian. There are very, very few times, and I see it in the notes in the chat group too. There's very few occasions when taking a capital city matters strategically to a war effort. And that's why I think in some ways this debate is it's not academic because it was important, but I think Clark made the decision he did, and I think had he gone after the German army, it may not have turned out much different. They still get Rome. It might just be a couple days later, a couple weeks later. And so as I've gotten older, I'm like, at some point, I don't quite get the debate as much as I used to. Like there are other things in the war, these decisions probably much more strategically important, led to more deaths. But I do think too, you can't talk Rome without talking Anzio. So they're two related to me.
I put up that photo there you sent us. So if you don't mind, I never plan exactly where these conversations are going to go, and we've talked about the battles at length. So let's deal with some more questions because there's some fantastic ones coming in. So this is more of a statement rather than a question. Robert is saying, if the Italian campaign had had more support, the Allies could have kept making amphibious jumps up the Italian coast trying to trap the Germans, and that is the limitations. The sheer lack of landing craft they have for Anzio never ceases to surprise me when I read it. I always think there's like a zero missing off the end of the figure. It's a lack of naval support generally. So that's interesting. Then Samuel Thompson is saying, my view of Italian campaign is it was a luxury the Allies could afford, and Churchill thought Germany could not. Churchill was wrong. But the other big things coming up are the Rapido River or the Gary River. So Gary August's question is remarkable. Why does John think, despite being absolved of blame for the Gary River Rapido episode, did Clark never publicly comment on it? Because a couple of people get really blamed for that. So take us through the Rapido and the crossing of rivers from your understanding of Clark's involvement and what he says and doesn't say about it.
Yeah, so the Rapido, particularly on the American side for the Texans, is a big deal. In fact, in 2008, I gave a talk at a 60th reunion for the 99th Division, which was not remotely involved. And that was one of the questions I got was Rapido, which Martin Blumenson actually wrote a pretty solid book on that as well. Now, and again, that's where, again, I was looking back on this to see if I've changed my views. The Rapido is one of those military tactical events that need to take place for your operation to succeed. And then, once your operation succeeds strategically, we always got to think about that. I do think a lot of the public is too hyper-focused on tactics at the expense of operation and strategy. I think the Rapido River was one of those just necessary, just tough fights that had to be fought to execute your operation that you foresaw as the commander. And I do think there were, again, I don't even know if there were that many, looking back on it, like real mishaps. It was just the Germans were well dug in where they were. It was a tough crossing site. The terrain favored the defender. And it was one of those things that I think the Fifth Army kept to a minimum. It didn't become a bigger issue than it was. I know there was lots of, criticism of how it was handled. But I think that's just one of those things in war where you're going to do these operations where years later we'll look back and be like, that probably could have gone differently. But I'm not sure Rapido. I don't know. There's not I don't know how you would, Napoleon's not coming back. I don't know how you're going to figure out a way to do what the Fifth Army had to do without Rapido. So I know that's not a great answer, but I think
it's fine. But it's not like it's the only advance in 1944 that can be questioned 80 years later. I'm thinking Hergen Forest. I'm looking at your direction right now, and things like that. And I was down in the Operation Cobra battlefields on Sunday, and I was talking to the Virginia Tech cadets I was with about the kind of the ambitious plans to drive off beyond Avranches, which the Patton's Third Army did, which in the end all came to the good because the Germans do Operation Luttich, and then the Falaise Gap happens, and but that could have gone wrong. There are other things in 44 that went the right way that could have gone the wrong way. And as you said there, the Rapido River to move up Italy, you've got to cross rivers. That you've got to do it some way. And so I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here, and and I've got a show with Jeff Hunt from Texas on Thursday about the 36th Division and the crossing the river. So I'm assuming he's going to be fairly negative about the whole plan and Clark, and that's fine. That we love different opinions. So were there any other options? I mean, you just said there weren't really.
I mean, if we do keep it in the realm of realism, of reality, no. So, in what I think too, people tend to forget about historians the same, and maybe because I was just there for 3 weeks, I was just got back from the second island chain, the Marianas Forager, to Guam, Saipan, Tinian. That's going on at the same time. And that is, I know it's a different theater, but that is a mammoth operation that people do not remember because there's no famous flag raising. There wasn't Band of Brothers. And I just think yes, if we had no Pacific theater, the Italian theater was the main event. Could you have done something? Sure. But that's just not reality to me. And the fact that the Allies could pull off in the Pacific an amphibious operation that begins in Pearl Harbor, that lands in Saipan, and then does a cross shore to Saipan and then Tinian while fighting Italy and then getting ready to launch into France. That's impressive.
We had a comment earlier from Rob Crane about the Germans, of course. So could Germany afford the Italian campaign? Would it have been more prudent to withdraw to the neck of Italy and have helped longer term? And the fact is that post Sicily and post the early probes into Italy, the Allies know that they've broken the back of the Luftwaffe. There's incredible losses in the early part of 1944. Italy have departed from the field of fire in terms of an army. So maybe there was some justified complacency that the Germans would be able to be rolled up much easier than they did. It was, as we now realize, another year. Well, if you go back as far as Salerno, it's 2 more years of slogging their way up the boot, or up the whole country. But can we forgive people for thinking the Germans would roll up because they did? Maybe they shouldn't have even defended it at all to the level they did. What's your take on that and the German response?
Yeah, I think, again, this goes back, and I've seen a lot of comments on counterfactuals. As I tell my students, they're great at bars. Just try not to write about them in your paper. But this is a discussion. I do think there is a way in which the Germans made a decision where they go to the Alps, which was part of the discussions. Why it's not realistic is because Hitler's in charge. He's not going to give up terrain. And that's just, reading Kershaw's 2 volumes on Hitler, if anyone hasn't, and it's pretty apparent. I do think there is some strategic sense in doing that, where they basically build a wall in the Alps, defend it. I don't think the war changes any outcome. I think the war is not over at this point, but the Germans got into a war they can't win in 1941. But I do think if a war game event, that would be a good thing to do, to look at and see what the Germans could do. I think it would have been effective. Now you're giving up all the terrain too, but you're in the Alps.
So just for balance, we had a couple of negative comments about Clark at the beginning. With the more positive ones are coming in now, which I was hoping to get. So Peter O'Connor is saying, how much was taking Rome a reward to Clark's long-suffering Fifth Army troops? So we talked about that earlier. Yeah, that there'd been a lot of fighting, a lot of death, a lot of misery, and okay, you say maybe that high from taking Rome didn't last very long, and I say the world then got the news of Overlord, 24 hours, 48 hours later. But that's the Peter's comment. And Merdiolo, who's one of our experts on the Mediterranean and the Italians and whatever, I think Clark's, despite genuine mistakes and faults, have been overrated. His bad reputation, of the 36th Division. So he's saying, the mistakes are overrated, and maybe Clark has become a bit of a fall guy for a lack of progression. But as I say, we started this with the idea that he is fighting his campaign with one arm tied behind his back, which we can definitely say the Normandy generals are not fighting with one arm tied behind their back. They have some issues with a storm in the middle of June, but they've got essentially resources aplenty. So when people look at as someone like yourself, okay, you teach World War II, but you've particularly focused on leaders and leadership in your writing. In the examination of characters and their personalities, does just the limitations of logistics and what they're having to deal with get a bit forgotten? And Clark can only fight with what he's got.
Yeah, I mean, no one wants to read about logistics for the most part. And I have logistic officers that will be like, yeah, I don't want to write on logistics. And it can be kind of a cop out to be like, yeah, it's all about logistics, which it's not untrue. But it's just the reality of the situation. If you don't have, you see it in Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
They lack certain resources to do what they want to do. You can be, Napoleon's ghost could come back and ride on horseback and go into Ukraine. Will he do some things that will be pretty cool, but he can't overcome mass and just logistics, sustainment. And that's where that going back to the, one arm tied behind your back, that's the Italian campaign. And that was the original title I had was Flawed but Essential to this book. And that was kind of how I viewed it, still do. I think it was a necessary theater politically too. You had to do it because if not, Cold War may look a little different. But the Allies couldn't have done really 1942, not done a major event operation until 44. I don't see how it works. But I do think this was the extent of the Allied resources showing itself here. And again, once Rome, a couple weeks after Rome falls, Clark loses 3 divisions, all go southern France. There you go.
Yeah. So great stuff there. So we Anzio, we can talk about. I'll ask you, your opinions on Lucas and Clark and whatever there. And then, you've already said we're going back and forth during the timeline. The decision to take Rome was not his greatest, but of course, there's 5 months nearly of fighting between January and June in 44. So during that period, what do you think Clark did well, and maybe what did you think Clark did less well? And if the things went less well, was it Clark's fault or was it some of his commander? You sent me the map of the 2nd and 6th Corps link up there in May. So take us through the sort of the Anzio up to Rome bit from Clark's point of view.
Yeah, so I think Anzio and Rome are linked because and I would argue I still wrote it that in the end Anzio does work. It does not achieve the timetable they wanted it to. Now also too, where I think a lot of folks forget is we don't have a lot of joint doctrine yet. And we certainly don't have a lot of experience with coalition multinational operations. And I think when you look at Anzio, it is that wildcat that became a whale, to use the Churchill quote. I think in planning, it's flawed for a couple of things that they had not quite figured out yet. But your landing forces can't be too separated. And then I think where Lucas gets deserved blame was and this is where, again, Truscott, I think, figured this out. And it's important to note, too, that the Army did more amphibious landings. They figured it out, that once you land on the beach, you got to expand.
Yeah.
And I think that's where Lucas lost his nerve a little bit. And didn't advance as he should have. And in that terrain where you saw was not, it's the beaches are the beaches, but it's the follow-on terrain that tends to be a problem, and planners tend to don't worry about that. They got bogged down. But I do think what makes Italy so hard to fight is it's truly a multinational coalition theater. And I think there is a lot of joint and there's a lot of doctrinal problems that they just haven't figured out yet. And I do think Clark does a decent job of kind of getting his staff to interpret kind of what Alexander's given them. And this is still a problem between the U.S. and Britain now. This was in 2009 and during Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, a British 2-star gave guidance very similar to one Harold Alexander would give Clark, meaning it's kind of vague, not tied to doctrine. And in this case, and I don't want to go off too far on that, but he said, put the enemy on the horns of a dilemma. Yeah. What does that mean to an American Army officer? Could mean a lot of things. And I think where we get lost in this is Alexander, who I know there's a lot of debate. Did Alexander order him to take down the German divisions, or did he go after Rome? I would argue the intent was there by Alexander, but it was not as clear as the Americans would, where it says, you do this, get that hill. And I think Clark, what get lost, and the historians tend to forget, that is, you're dealing with allied partners. We speak the same language, but not always. And I think Clark and his staff do a good job of taking higher authority, passing it down, translating it throughout their force. I think Anzio, some planning flaws, but eventually they get to go. I think Rapido is one of these just necessary events that, maybe a more genius commander could have figured some other way. But I think Clark, could Lucas have done more? Sure. Again, I don't want to quite blame Clark, who was, or Lucas, but he was probably not the right man for his job. And I think he proved that. He gets promoted to a, position in the U.S. But I think Clark does a good job of managing all these lack of resources, all these forces coming to him with some training, some little, and then dealing with the terrain. And then let's not forget, the Germans were pretty good on the defense here.
Yeah. I mean, and that is coming up in the sidebar now about the Germans didn't particularly throw more divisions into Italy that could have gone to Normandy, but there were divisions that stayed in Italy that could have been sent elsewhere to Normandy. So the fact they stayed there benefited the Normandy plan. And the subject, it came up with Mark Zelke, I think, and others, is that now 80 years on, we can look at the attritional aspect of Italy. And now I know no one ever goes into a war to wear down the enemy slowly. It's not dramatic enough. It doesn't make the headlines, but there are certain battles in that war we can say, well, okay, it took its time, but look how we wore down the enemy. Look how they were depleted during that time. And Italy, definitely, the Allies are depleted as well, but the Allies are working on the principle that there is more stuff being made. They've got more stuff coming in. Everything the Germans lose, most things they lose, they can't replace. So, and the other thing I think I want to ask you about is, if we're comparing the events of Italy 44 to Operation Overlord, Overlord had 2 years of planning and all that resources and all the aerial photos, all the intelligence. There's the transportation plan, the resistance network. I mean, the plan, the Anzio and Diadem plans, they were kind of put together in a matter. It's not quite hours or days, but it's certainly just a couple of weeks. And then eventually, you're going to have to hit that Highway 6 up past that high ground, up past Cassino. There's no way of out-maneuvering, not with the resources they have. The idea of the amphibious landings moving up would have been okay had there been the resources to do that, but there aren't. So they've got to go via the land, which means eventually you got to go past those hills. There's no way you can do it. So Clark, again, his hands are tied a little bit by the Germans kind of know where he's going to go, don't they?
Yep. Yeah, and looking at again, it's been a few years since I've been to Anzio, but again, having just been on Forager, a couple students asked, like, could we have landed more people here? And I'm like, not really. And that's what another thing is, like, say we have more divisions, you can't just land them all on these narrow Italian beaches. It's not Normandy.
Yeah.
And then the terrain, the road network, it's just so in some extent makes perfect sense. But yeah, the planning wasn't there. There's no great deception operation either. And again, to some extent, we talk about the Rapido. Anzio is one of those things, like, it's going to be a hard fight. And I think we want these great, Caesar victories where he just comes in and he sees, he conquers, and that's it. And Anzio, it is like, again, I hate to use that phrase. It's all in all the books I've written on Italy, but it's a slog.
Yeah.
The way around it.
No, absolutely. So let's talk. I had the map up earlier, but I'll put it up again now. Let's talk about the events of May. So a month before the eventual liberation of Rome, there's got to be some movements on the map there. So the Anzio is kind of in the past now, but as you say, there's still this direct connection to Rome. But what does Clark do next, and what could he have done better, and what should he have done differently? Take us through it from your point of view, Jon.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's some criticism of Clark going to the link up where the units meet, and that is posted in this map right where they meet up. I think that's probably, I don't know. And Clark was pretty open about it because it was a big deal for me. I needed to go there. And again, I do think, Clark, Eisenhower's staff gets talked about being so great. Patton's staff always gets kind of crushed by critics. I'm not sure why. But a good commander, if their staff, which Clark, I think his staff was pretty professional, a commander can step away for a few hours to see where his units are meeting. It's a big deal, and everything can function rather smoothly. But I think as we get to the June timeline, I think another thing people focus on is, they see this map right here, and it's like, oh, it makes logical sense. They just kept flowing. The Allies kept flowing. They finally meet up. The terrain, the heat, it's not that easy of a fight. And I think Clark, where I think he gets forgotten, is he was a very good trainer. And I think the level of training in the years prior, and I know some of these units come and go, but they knew what to expect, what to do. And I think this is when Clark was probably better, when he's kind of it's just daily operations, just running. Things are going pretty smooth. So I don't really have a vast criticism. This is one of those things in history where, these generals are just day in, day out. They're getting up, doing their thing, their staff. And by this point in the war, Clark and most of his staff, it's been 2 years. They know what they're doing. And so I think he was, there's, again, if people are looking for some magic theory or silver bullet on how he could have been faster, I just don't think it's realistic.
That's fair enough. So we had a couple of comments about his affection or lack thereof for the British. So Gary said, begs the question, does Jon believe the perception that Clark was an Anglophobe? And Murdio Lou says, what I do not get is Clark's friction with British generals and unwillingness to cooperate. Best allied general of the Italian campaign, along with Truscott, was General Richard McCreary. I would add, before I let you answer that, it's not just British generals. There's New Zealand, Indian, a Canadian, South African, Polish, French. Who else have I missed in the nationality?
We'll have Brazilians eventually.
Yeah, so he's not Admiral King, is he? He's not an absolute rabid Anglophobe, is he? But
yeah.
So what's your take on that? What's your response to him being prickly with the British?
Yeah, so he's not King. You mentioned King. That's funny. He's not that bad, but because no one was. However, I think
even Hitler wasn't quite as anti-English as King was.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. Is he an Anglophobe? I don't know if he's so much an Anglophobe or he just didn't like Alexander, which seems to be the problem. Right. I do think that there's some issues there. I do not think Clark appreciated the British as much as he probably should have. And again, as a proper American historian, I actually try not to. I think the Brits in Montgomery, they did fine to me. I know a lot of Americans are like, the Montgomery was slow. I'm like, you guys were just running out of people.
Yeah.
So I do think he was and I think around this time, if you look, and I was re-looking at some of his diary entries, pretty anti-British, but I think it's still very more anti-Alexander than anything. But if you were to call him an Anglophobe, I'm not going to argue too much against it. And that was the thing early on in 41, 42, when he first gets to England with Eisenhower. He gets along well with the Brits. So maybe it's their sophisticated dry humor he didn't like.
And people are coming up in the side by Great Dominion saying is that Alexander seems to be a fairly affable person. I mean, I'm quite an Alexander fan. So, but that doesn't mean if just Clark didn't particularly like him, that Clark is a bad person or Alexander is a bad person. Personality clashes can happen, and they can change with time. They can change over the course of months and years, as we know with some other command relationships in world. But Bradley and Patton had ups and downs. So it's not unique that there are command issues. And a lot of that we've discussed on this channel is just the fact, as you said yourself a minute ago, they've been at this for 2 years. Anybody, you that thing when you go, you think you've got a couple of best mates at work, and then you go away for a couple of weeks together and you realize that 2 weeks in each other's companies are maybe a bit too much. So you come back for holiday, you don't talk about it, then you realize you're perfectly good work colleagues, we don't want to go on holiday together. And that's a weird analogy. But a lot of these commanders are spending shitloads of time with each other with shitloads of stress to deal with. And no wonder relationships got a little bit stressed at times.
Yeah, no. And I think people make too big of a deal about egos and generals because they say particularly Patton, he had this, oh, there's my dogs. He had a real big ego. Eisenhower, I think, had the biggest ego of them all. He just didn't wear it on his sleeve. And all these guys, Clark included, had an ego. And I don't think it's a bad thing. If you're going to be an Army commander, you damn well better have an ego. And does it clash with other people's? Yeah, it does. And that's why I saw the comment on Alexander being like, everyone seemed to like Alexander. I agree. But I think something about how he carried himself, the way he delivered orders never sat well with Clark. But again, I'm just making, I'm spitballing here. But I do think the egos, certain people just do not get along. Nothing you can do about it.
No, it's a valid point. And these things happen in war. They happen in real life. That's just how it is. And so we talked a little bit about the link up there. Let's kind of bring the other map in there and again the kind of the next page they're expanding and pushing on there. And we've got another couple of questions I'll ask you. But so the link up of the course happened, and then we're going to have to get to the elephant in the room again of Rome and Cassino and Highway 6 and all that high ground there. So again, from your point of view, your studying of Clark, how did he manage the late May, early June stages there? What could he have done better? We've talked about the decision for Rome, but generally in terms of command, use of units, what's your take on things?
Yeah, no, I think this is where I think Clark starts to interpret what is seen on the ground, and where this is where again I think by end of May he's looking for ways to switch the axis of the attack and get Rome, and that's where I think again, and I wrote in the book. The biggest mistake of his career was this decision in Rome. And I don't, and again, that said, I don't think it had big disastrous effects. And I don't think it was a given the Germans would have been surrounded. But again, the plan and this debate about did Alexander order it? And like he did, it wasn't as direct as, a lot of Americans want it to be. But I think everyone had a plan, and it was all the way down to the lower echelons. I mean, Truscott clearly knew what the plan was, and where I think Clark gets in his own way here is he starts to see events on the ground shape. He wants something to happen, and it's this confirmation bias. He's going to make sure it happens, and because he's the Army commander, he can. And I think that's where, again, did it have any disastrous effects on the operations at the time? No. But I do think he's starting to see things in the shadow. He's starting to give himself reasons to make this switch happen. And then you see that comment on Val Montoni. That to me is the critical. Again, it's not as clear cut as I think Clark wanted it to be, but it's clear where the Army was going and what the plan was.
Yeah, definitely. Quick, simple question from Norma. Was Clark on the list to receive ultra decrypts?
Now, at this point, I don't even, you know what? I'll do something most historians don't. I don't know.
I feel he wasn't at this point, but
I
I
would,
may be wrong. This is when
yeah,
we need to
I would think
summon
so,
David
but
O'Keefe. He'll know.
yeah, I'm also not. Again, I don't want to bag on intel. The intelligence is always going to have problems, but I think at this point the Allies though had a good idea what the Germans were doing, and what their plans were, with or without Ultra.
Except, to be devil's advocate again, by June 44, what the Allies want to know about is what the Germans are thinking about France. That is their absolute number one priority. They're and there's only so much they can decrypt, so much focus they can put on analyzing, and everything they want to know in June, even in late May, June, and even beyond D-Day is who's going to Normandy, which divisions are going there, which corps are there, which panzer divisions. Even in the terms of gaining information, Italy is going to come a very, very poor second on that list at that point. So we're back to the analogy of having one arm tied behind his back. So even if he was on the list, he's not going to be receiving top priority information, I'm guessing.
No, and then it's also one of these things I see in the comment about Ultra when a commander at this level, you know how much information's flowing to his desk. He can't. You're not a computer, and there's only so much you're going to process. And I saw the comment like there were commanders in the war that were dismissive of it.
Well, there were. Yeah,
and it's a general reaction. You still see it to this day. Even you can have ISR, drones flying, and you'll see commanders are like, I don't know if I trust it. That's just one of those, this continuity of war.
No, definitely. We've talked about that before, how, we post all the information being released about the code breaking. We all take it for granted that it's this incredible ace that the Allies can play throughout the war. Everybody realized it was brilliant. But as you said there, people were hesitant to believe it could be true. And of course, you can't just take what you get from Ultra as the only source. You still get interrogations from POWs, you use aerial reconnaissance, you use local information. It's never going to be this absolute game changer. It's not being given the result, the answers to the exam 5 minutes before you go into examination hall. It's not that good. It's additional information, isn't it?
And I think that's a big thing to focus on. Is it's one piece of the pie, and I think in hindsight, Ultra looks way more useful than it was in reality.
Yeah, because we cherry pick we cherry in some ways the examples of things that it worked really well. And Michael Dunn just made a point where was Italy a case where Ultra may have actually clouded things, thinking of Rommel wanting to defend in the north, but Kesselring wanting to do a fighting withdrawal. Maybe they were even getting mixed information from Italy because the Germans themselves hadn't fully decided what they were going to do. So that's a very good point. Thank you for that one there. So, we've got a couple more questions for you. We're going to go scattergun there, but Monte Cassino, could Clark have prevented the Monte Cassino bombing?
So, and in my book, I am not as harsh on Clark on Monte Cassino because now, could he have made a bigger defense against the bombing? I think he could have. Would it have mattered? No, I don't think so. I don't think it was going to be prevented. That's again in 1944. If I'm on the ground and I'm a soldier looking up at Monte Cassino, which is what I appreciate about the Italians. You go to all these hills in Italy and they're a mile high. It was, if I would have been, let's bomb it. I do know Clark was against it for a lot of reasons, mainly too, because it would make it more defensible. But it was not really on him. That was Freiberg, and that made that call. And it was supported by, again, had Clark had the similar situation in France, he might have been able to stop it. But here, where it's much more multinational, I don't think he could have. And if he tried, I don't know if it mattered. But also, too, this is as a commander, I'm not sure Clark was going to risk his career over this event. He was against it, though. very adamant about it, protested it, but it was, if he would have said, no, we cannot do this, maybe, but he never did. But
well, we did the show with Luke Truxell 10 days ago about the air plan and the interdiction plan, which was in conjunction with Diadem and the attack and the push on the Cassino, but it was not planned to directly support it. So to some extent, Clark's hands were tied in terms of what the air plan was, because it was beyond his pay, not beyond his pay grade, but outside of his zone of responsibility. So there's that aspect as well. But you mentioned Freiburg there, which is a good time to then ask you, when you were putting the book together and in your research, did Clark leave clear indications of who he liked and who he didn't like? Because some of the generals and commanders were very clear and blunt about, this guy was a twat, this guy was really fantastic. Was Clark the same, or did you kind of read between the lines? Were you getting information from staff officers? Paint us a picture, for example, using Freiburg as an example. Do you know what Clark thought of Freiburg?
So, and this is another problem with the memoirs, the diaries, and Clark's diaries, unlike Patton's, were not handwritten by him. So they're kind of a little more third person. And that is one of the things with memoirs I'm leaving aside, but the diaries and the journals they kept, I would argue at one point they all called each other some kind of name. And again, it's just like, you can get along great with your boss, but every now and then he's going to make a decision. You're like, he sucks. So he spent a lot of time, and again, it's all dependent on, when he was deputy under Eisenhower, he talked a lot about Eisenhower, some of the French commanders. I did note it's similar to how Patton relationship with Eisenhower went. As the war goes on, Clark and Patton both kind of viewed Eisenhower the same, which I thought was kind of interesting. And Blumenson talked about it too, and I think he's right. Their friendship, Clark, Patton, and Eisenhower, kind of unraveled, and Blumenson blames Eisenhower more for it than anything. Clark specifically, very anti-Harold Alexander at times, as you would all be expect. I'd have to go through all the things. If I recall, there was not that much on Freiburg, because it just, he's there for a moment and then he's gone. And I do think it goes back to the decision at Monte Cassino. Clark's just is an Army commander. There's other air commands, the naval command. This is not quite a joint task force like we would have nowadays.
Yeah.
But I would say, and I saw a question earlier about his memoir, until I read Howland Smith's memoir in the Pacific, I thought Clark's was probably the worst one that he could have written. In the way that it's the most anti, a lot of generals, including Eisenhower, Alexander. He airs, I think, too much dirty laundry, and it comes off. I don't think it helped his cause. I think a more modern example, Tommy Franks, from Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, 2004, wrote a memoir that has largely hurt his post-military career. I just think at one point these guys all have pithy comments about each other, but Clark does get, when he talks more, I see in the quote, the Brits particularly. So there are some times too where he's very positive about Alexander. Just depends on, usually early in the year.
James Holland always makes this point, and so does Peter Caddick Adams, that if you go through the various correspondence, you can find plenty of examples of commanders being horrible to each other, as you said there, and also ones of them being nice to each other. We were out the other day, a few of us historians at the pub, and we were saying, if people were doing a documentary about my relationship with Mag, they could find lots of times where we're screaming at each other, and it seems like we've got the worst relationship in the history of mankind. And there are other occasions when they could build a picture of us having this really weird Hallmark movie, blissful romance. The point is, our relationship is somewhere in the middle that swings back and forth depending on the circumstances. And not that I'm describing that Clark and Alexander had a pseudo marriage, but that as I said earlier, over the course of that 2 years of campaign. Of course, they're going to have highs and lows. Of course, they're going to have. Look at the Allies at Casablanca conference. Look at all the disagreements there. Look at FDR and Churchill at the time of Torch. You know, ups and downs are inevitable with this amount of of stress going on. So I think the occasional bad word does not necessarily.
Yeah, to me, it wasn't. It's one of these things. You see it in time immemorial. There's always some general bags making fun of someone else. And it's just a reminder to remember that these aren't marble men. You know, these were real humans. And at this point, Clark's been at war for 3 years.
Yeah.
He's even though he is the youngest 4-star, he's got to be pretty tired.
Yeah. So we had a very simple question, really, and I wasn't going to put it up there, and I thought actually it's grown on me, Andreas, over the minutes I've been sitting there, because a lot of people these days, when I'm meeting people on a tour or something, they've got a very firm idea of what type of a general someone is. So Bradley is the soldier's general, steady, and Patton's kind of explosive and dynamic and blah blah blah, and Montgomery's whatever it is. So Andreas is saying, would you describe Clark as a frontline general or a dugout Doug type, or somewhere in between? I mean, for me, he's a little bit of both, mostly the former, but a little. How would you do if you had to sum up in one word?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about it. Patton's, it's an easy one. He's a frontline guy, and even in World War I, he was always in the front line to his detriment.
Yeah.
I do think I wrote this in the book too. Clark's performance, he doesn't like Clark either. We have someone coming to my door, so we'll have to deal with them. But I think Clark, going back to Salerno, I mean, he was actually on the ground and helped take out a tank with a unit, which, in hindsight, I don't want my 3-star general doing that. But I do think he was a bit of, if I'm trying to think of the war names you mentioned, and I'm not a big fan of MacArthur, so there's no argument.
Very few people on World War II TV are, to be fair.
Yeah, and I work in a building that has basically every room named after MacArthur. I would say he's a bit of a mix, but I think he is viewed as more of a dugout Doug guy, and I think that's probably a little unfair.
I mean, thank you for that. I mean, but this interesting thing is, as you said yourself a minute ago, being at the front line isn't necessarily a good quality. I mean, I'm going to go off and talk about Market Garden now because I'm in a good mood today. I've been out on the battlefield. So when you watch A Bridge Too Far and you see Sean Connery shoot the German through the window, you go, in your mind goes, oh, isn't that cool? James Bond just shot the German through the window there. But the other part of my brain goes, what the hell is the divisional commander doing, having cut himself off from his troops in the middle of Arnhem, getting involved in a pistol fight? That's not his job. That's his not responsibility. Why the hell is he not commanding the division from where he should be? So being up at the front line does not afford a general always the best view of the battle. You don't want to be 100 miles away, but you want to be in the right position to command things. And so let's springboard off that. Do you think Clark kept himself, broadly speaking, in the right place to have a good broad overview of the Italian campaign? Was his management basically from the right place, do you think?
Yeah. I got no real issues. And there was not where you see it with Patton, where sometimes he can't be found. There's none of that with with Clark. I do think because he was younger, I would like to think he was aware of that and tried his best to. And that's where I think he was good. He was very active. He was always out and about. He dealt with some issues that, again, it probably is an army commander, like finding shoes for soldiers. It's cool. Like, you're like, hey, general, that's awesome. But do you really want your 3-4-star general doing that? Probably not. But that is all part of that leadership. You're an organizational leader, but at times you can be that tactical leader. And Clark did have a lot of experience, not as much as you would think from a 4-star general at the time, because a lot of World War I, he just didn't get the reps that, say, Patton did. And I can't recall anything from an enlisted soldier to one of his 2-star staff officers, mentioning, like, we can't find Clark. Where is he? Is he hiding? And I know Clark was very hard on guys like Lucas for basically staying too close to their command post. So I thought, again, I'd have to look at it in more detail, but nothing I can recall that where Clark seemed to have the right balance.
Brilliant. That's a great response. So as we kind of near towards the end of this now, I mean, you said, your book is 10 years old now. You've kind of reread it again now. You've had a look at James Holland's book. Do you think Clark is entering a period of reevaluation? And if he is entering a period of reevaluation, do you think he'll come out of it better or worse? I mean, as you said, Blumenson was a fan, but that's going to be 50 years ago or so. He was writing about it. And then I think since then he took a downward turn. So do you think he's on the beginning of an upward tick right now?
I mean, based on the last, this is, again, it's Italian theater, doesn't get a lot of books. So I would say he's on an upward trend. Like I said, I think I was fair, but I think I tried to put him in a better light, at least a better understanding. So I do think there is, and again, it's just based off of 1 or 2 books, that he seems to be getting a better view. Now, I know there was a podcast that the Army War College did, and I think in Holland, James Holland wrote about it too. I do think historians are lazy with how we view Clark. There's a lot of, he did not get along with the press, for right or wrong. That's what shaded almost how he's viewed. And so all these historians a lot of them too don't write specifically enough about the campaign. So what they do is they do a little deep dive into them, and they're like, hey, okay, they didn't like him, so that must be true. And that's where, one of the big points I think I've over the last 10 years, there's just not a lot of evidence like that proves that Clark was just this raging asshole. The media didn't get along with him, but that's twofold. There was a lot of antagonism towards Clark because he was so young.
Yeah.
And that's not his fault. That's just the way it is. But there's not a lot of actual evidence to support that he was this, that no one liked him.
Definitely.
It's journalists from the 40s and the 50s. And then I do think Blumenson was right about this. He viewed Clark as one of the 5 most important people of the war. So you got Patton, had a big movie. Everyone remembers Patton. They remember George C. Scott. Eisenhower becomes the big general, becomes president. Then you have guys like Marshall, who I think is still appreciated. But if we go the general public, they don't know who Omar Bradley is. And I'm not the biggest fan of Bradley. Mainly for some of the things he does prior to Battle of the Bulge. But Clark was also on that list. And Clark, I think Blumenson's right. The problem with Clark is he lived too long. And I argued in my Patton book, the best thing to happen to Patton's legacy was that he died in 1945. Because had he lived, the stuff
he carried on putting his foot in his mouth.
Public,
and I think the best thing
And-
for Montgomery's career would have been for him to die in 1945 as well, because the longer his life went on, the more he reinvented all his history to favor himself, and the more arrogant he appeared. And I'm a Montgomery fan, but I'm not a great fan of Montgomery promoting himself all the time. And Mark Calhoun, another fellow historian, made a good point there about in Korea, with the first U.S. commander obliged to sign an armistice without being the victor. I mean, that Korean story is an interesting one there that he carries on to there. And Korea's if any war deserves the title of Forgotten War, it is. It doesn't deserve it, but it absolutely has the Forgotten War tag. So to round things off, Clark is. I'm listening to what you're saying. I've read what James Holland says, and I don't. He's not my favorite, but I think he's been handed a pretty crappy deal by history. Because he was handed a pretty crappy deal himself. And what you said about the press there is that he's bitter even in 44 about the lack of resources Italy's getting. He's bitter about the weather. He's bitter about some. So he probably isn't the most not always the happiest guy at press conferences because of the battle he's fighting. He's not, which brings us back to Rome again. And the one time he's able to deliver a victory, maybe not strategically the best one, but he the rug gets pulled out from under his feet by D-Day happening just afterwards. That must have pissed him off.
Oh yeah. I think it's understandable. But I think that, and that's the proper view, is that I don't view Clark, nor do I write about that Clark is this, Patton-esque figure. He's a good professional general.
That's it. I mean, we the cadets I was with at the weekend were saying that we kind of need to accept, sometimes in military terms, and maybe this is part of your training, is that sometimes accepting that good enough is fine. Just being good enough to get the job done. Is the Sherman tank the best tank of World War II? No, but it's good enough. The Clark could Italy have gone better? Sure, but the campaign eventually was successful, so he did well enough, I guess. And and some things went against him that weren't his fault, which is what we've established. Whereas you could argue in Normandy, some things go in the Allies' favor there that they weren't expecting, namely the Germans doing Operation Lüttich, which sped things up there and brought the Normandy campaign to an end that might not have happened had the Germans not played badly played their joker at that point, in a sense. So
yeah,
well, I mean, I'm going to bring you back on again at some point, John, if you want to, because I think we can carry on this conversation. We will end things now. Because I've absolutely loved talking to you, and I think people come away from this with some insight, but also some desire to go and read more about Clark, and they can do no worse than starting with your book, I guess.
That's right. That's right. That it will be a life-changing book. It's a quick, easy read.
Brilliant stuff.
Well, and I'm beyond any time we can talk about numerous things, not just Italy. Like I said, I am now an expert on the Pacific, which I loathe the Pacific.
Well, let's do some of that. We've done that before, so I'll bring you back in for something else. So, folks, I've got a day off tomorrow. We moved this one forward a day, so you'll see me back again on Thursday with Jeff Hunt talking about the 36th Division on the Rapido River. So that may bring some more insight there, and then we've got more shows coming up. Just scheduled the Polish show that's going to be later in the month with Paul Latowski, which I'm really pleased about. So, John, thank you very much for your insight. Thank you very much, your sidebar warriors, for some amazing questions and comments. We couldn't get to them all, but they're all fantastic. Don't forget, click like and subscribe. Buy my guests' books because it makes it worthwhile them coming on the channel. And enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, everybody. Cheers, everybody. Bye.